removing the perspective that we used to have about vocational training in this country is probably the most important thing to do to save the US job.
We are building learning profiles of students and then letting that inform the pedagogy, not the other way around.
One size does not fit all. Everyone has a different life, different expectations, and different ways of learning.
We need to find career happiness to have a better life.
Welcome to Better Careers, Better Lives, a show that features leaders in education, technology, and the skilled trade industries, and how they are making an impact in their respective fields by providing pathways to better careers and better lives. I'm your host, Doug Donovan, founder and CEO of Interplay Learning. On today's show, my guest is Ash Kaluarachchi, CEO and Managing Director of StartEd. Ash, thank you for coming today. It's great to have you here.
Doug, thanks for having me.
I consider myself an EdTech nerd. I think I watch the market
Likewise.
closely, and so it's a treat to sit with another EdTech nerd. So let's start with the accelerator. Let's start with StartEd, and tell me a little bit about it. How'd you start it? Where are you now?
Sure. So StartEd focuses on attracting and developing education innovators. And like a good learning organization, we try to meet the learner where they are in their journey and try to meet our objective. So I spent most of my life building EdTech accelerators, and this latest attempt is my way of trying to get it right.
Yeah. I would imagine, just with COVID, with the skills gap, these macro trends really happening, driving a lot of this. Tell me, what part of the market are you seeing a lot of attention by technology companies saying, there's a problem here, I think I can help?
So we all know that the most recent experience folks had in EdTech was somewhat involuntary, right? There was the largest user test in EdTech in history,
right.
is another way to look at it. And a fair portion of those folks had a good experience. I think a surprisingly large number of those few billion folks. And a certain portion may not have had a great experience, but I think the overwhelming majority did.
Yeah.
And depending on where that individual learner or educator is on their journey in the lifelong learning cycle, they had a little bit of a different experience, right? So I tend to look at EdTech as 5 different verticals. So early childhood, K-12, higher ed, workforce learning, and lifelong adult learning, if you think of it in terms of how we grew up and learn as a human being. And each of those areas changed and morphed a little bit differently.
Sure, yeah.
I think what people consider EdTech traditionally was really K-12 and higher ed, but a lot of the innovators, including yourselves, are proving true that you can actually learn and work and enhance yourself as a human being throughout your life.
Well past that's exactly right. We've seen, certainly not just Interplay, but plenty of companies focused lifelong learning and post-secondary beyond. And the employers are getting more involved. So while we're there, let's stay focused on that side of the market. What are some of the trends you're seeing? Let's just start with employer training. Obviously Guild Education, big name. They've really introduced a whole category with education as a service for employers. What other kind of trends are you seeing at the employer level?
Great question. The systemic problem that founders need to address is really this connection between careers and their education, right? So at the foundational level, there's this misstep that tends to happen, and these transitionary phases in one's life tend to be ripe for reassessment, redirection, and really that can happen continuously through one's life as they migrate through different careers and different types of opportunities. Now, what I find interesting is that as organizations have understood how adult learning is different from children learning, we've developed a new whole set of tools, right? And I think most folks even still talk about pedagogy in education when we should be talking about andragogy, right? Which is a little bit different.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So as we understand that experiential learning is a foundational of how we learn, adults tend to like feedback, they can process that information, they can iterate, great learners do that quickly. We're building solutions now that recognize the fact that learners can control their own path.
Right. Particularly, if you're an employee, you're still learning. You're learning every day, whether that's inside the organization or searching outside, right? Like at our company, we do have a learning stipend. Like, go learn how to, bake a cake. You can learn anything. You should always be learning. So we've seen that, with not only ourselves, but also our customers, we're seeing our customers, many of whom are either SMBs or enterprises, and they're all investing more in learning all around. Are you seeing that as well with some of your other companies?
It's so important that they do. It's used to be a benefit, but Rachel and the team at Guild have made it an essential requirement.
Yeah, you do see that a little more now. Yeah.
If you aren't providing some kind of training, whether it's even simple as identifying a Sherpa within the organization to scaffold up a young worker, or if it's something more hands-on, like bringing in an organization or creating a structure within the company, people are starting to expect it just as much as they would with PTO.
Yeah, and what are the implications for the companies who haven't figured this out yet? Are you seeing any trends there?
Yeah, I mean, most of them are losing their employees, right? I mean, it's an employees' market. If you're not serving and providing the basic needs, which now include training to an employee, you're going to lose your best folks and most of the rest of them too.
Yeah, that's probably right. Let's go back. You said something interesting about the transitory processes. Are we talking like making a choice out of high school? Are we talking post-secondary? Tell me a little bit about how you see that map.
Well, we've looked at this process of lifelong learning as sequential, right? And now, since those transitory phases have fractured, those layers are starting to overlap over each other, right? So I was speaking with this fantastic founder the other day who was helping 14-year-olds find apprenticeships with Google, get paid, and sometimes earn more than their parents are making in India, right?
Yeah.
That's fundamentally changing and allowing the individual to say, yeah, I want to be a contributing member of society from this age. And that's going to be the individual, right?
Right.
It's not their parent, it's not any third party. So that's really interesting. It's another option that didn't really exist 5-10 years ago. Additionally, there's this idea of within the transitionary phases, the phases themselves are getting shorter, right? What I mean by that is the skill set that got you a job as a data analyst 5-10 years ago is going to be outdated much quicker than it used to be, and it's going to keep getting truncated. And it's required that you go back to school to upgrade your skill set more and more frequently. That's only going to get better or worse, depending on your perspective.
And I would imagine in that context, school could be defined very differently than we previously did, right? Like the online on-demand catalogs of learning or short courses, certificate programs. What are some of those things you're seeing?
Right. It's no longer a shift, it's not a 100% shift between work and learning.
Right.
It's code switching. It's considering certain minutes in your day as application and learning and feedback gathering, and then there's the content, right?
Yeah.
So I think the iterative cycle of learning has become something that you do on a daily basis.
Right. Yeah, we hear what's the phrase they're saying, learning in the flow of work, right? And we think about that in our product and try to figure out how do we make this accessible to the worker at the time they need it. We do a lot of foundational training too that's probably in advance of going in the field, for example. But I've seen some really innovative solutions about just-in-time training. Tell me, I'd love to hear a story or two about a company in the incubator that you thought, geez, this could be really compelling if it works. I'd love to hear some of those.
Certainly. I mean, we've had companies and founders come through our programs with every caste and creed, right? And some of the solutions that we started seeing 5-10 years ago are now starting to come on the scene and becoming a little bit more, again, get a little bit more visibility. There was a great company called Synapse from our 2015 program that really helped an organization not lose its tribal knowledge when the employees left. So just before you leave, as a senior executive or a mid-level employee, you would turn what you know about the organization, both its technical know-how, but also its tribal know-how, into a masterclass or content that generations from then would consume.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we see it, serving the skilled trades. They talk about the gray tsunami, right? This resignation of skilled workers who've put in their 35, 40 years and their knees are shot and they're calling it a career. And there hasn't been a lot of people to fill that gap, right? There's a demographic and reasons for that, as well as just a shift in focus in different generations. Like my generation was told 4-year degree or nothing.
Right.
And so that's now being felt in that marketplace. But that's been a huge challenge, is how do we capture all of that institutional technical knowledge from those retiring folks and impart it to the next generation.
Right.
Yeah, fantastic that somebody's focused on that day to day. I think it's going to make a big difference.
And it's not necessarily just about knowledge as a whole, it's also about recognizing that people are developing skills and gaining them, both on the technical side and the soft skills side, almost on a daily basis. And that signal used to be the 4-year degree. Right? I can guess based on where you went to school or where you grew up, how much training I'll probably need to provide you and how prescriptive I need to be on a daily basis as a manager. Now, you can actually find a signal in a micro-credential that they acquired over a weekend.
Yes.
Right, or over several years, that signals, okay, I actually don't need to spend as much time scaffolding this worker up. I can probably even have them be a Sherpa to others.
And you think those signals, there's a point where, I do mean a lot, right? There's a little side piece of paper for this weekend class or this. Do you think it's really being respected now? Employers are recognizing the value?
Well, I mean, the largest tech firms have thrown out taking the degree seriously, right?
Yes.
And they've actually pivoted their own, right? So Google's own certifications are a good example of it. But on a daily basis, it's not necessarily the technical skill set that managers are looking for anymore. It's the soft skills. That's really hard to assess and measure.
Yes.
Can you think critically?
Right,
How are you going to collaborate with others? Can you actually manage upward?
Yes.
What's your communication skill, right? So those are the skill sets that I think are fascinating when it comes to micro-credentialing, because people are building rubrics that help a manager figure out what training to provide there or not.
And do you see, I mean, soft skills is tough, right? It's tough to train. Some things that feel like they should be inherent in some cases. Have you seen some interesting models, technologies to help accelerate that?
I don't think it's necessarily about the technology. It's at a fundamental level about the learning design and people understanding of the andragogy of the technology behind it.
Right.
And, for example, that's primarily what I teach at StartEd.
Yeah.
I don't need to teach someone how to code. What I need to teach is how do you find someone who you gel with and understand a particular problem? How can you guess and qualify an investor or an advisor just by doing the research on them online, right? Build a hypothesis about whether you can actually have a relationship with someone. How do you have a first conversation with them and assess whether you want to work with them? Can you create a bidirectional mutual value flow in a first conversation, right? And then how do you turn that into a relationship? Those are the skill sets that an entrepreneur really needs, and no one's really teaching yet.
Got it. It's interesting. I mean, those skill sets, you don't need to be in EdTech for that, right? I mean, that certainly applies broadly. What brought you to EdTech personally? Like, what was the why when you said, I want to focus on EdTech?
I tried to give a reasonable why, but it was an accident. I just happened to be at a talk that one of our alumni gave, one of my business school alumni gave, and she said, you know what, I'm doing something interesting. This is the mid-2000s. I'm doing something interesting in New York. Why don't you come out and check it out? And that was one of the US's first EdTech accelerators. And then, I went on to join the team at Techstars when that company was
Still focused on the education space or more broadly?
Well, I became a bit of a one-trick pony because I just went from EdTech accelerator to EdTech accelerator and kept building those, including workforce in this definition. And then all of a sudden, one day I woke up and I had created the most EdTech accelerators of anyone.
Yeah.
And I had decided, okay, maybe this model needs to change. So StartEd's my attempt at actually unbundling the incentives that capital creates from the learning and networking that a young founder needs through their growth as an education organization.
Meaning, let's say that again, I'm not sure I quite follow that. Unbundling like the need for capital and also the need to build this sort of mission-driven organization. I'm not sure I followed that.
Let me say that in another way.
Yeah.
So there's this great writer called Ann Fields. She talks about how her studies of accelerators, specifically those that focus on social enterprise, tend to be distracted by the hunt for venture capital, right?
Got it.
Venture capital is an essential tool. It's a tool to be used at the right time and place. However, social enterprises probably would do better to build connections with their communities, understand the problems that the end user is facing before chasing venture capital, which sets sometimes an arguably artificial deadline on growth.
Yes, yeah, I mean, it makes sense. So and now I think young organizations are more sophisticated now. They know they have to show some early traction. They have to. You can't just show up with a laptop and an idea anymore. Exactly. I think there's too much of that. You mentioned workforce development. A very broad term. Sometimes it means workforce in a company. Sometimes it means outside of the traditional means of on-ramping onto a career. What are you seeing in the workforce development world on different pathing and how people are on-ramping into different industries or careers? What's unique in that space now rather than say 5 years ago?
I think there's this recognition of who was most affected by the last couple of years. That's one part of this big problem, right? And the folks who graduated from high school, the folks who would have traditionally gone into a post-secondary experience for the last couple of years, weren't necessarily supported by the same kind of social dynamics that get us into those next ideal roles.
Yeah.
We didn't meet that professor who said, oh, you know what, you should check out this cool. We didn't have that older brother who said, I really love my experience there at the college, you should totally go there.
Right.
Those social dynamics that kind of drive us to make the decisions we did, which ultimately is an emotional decision, right?
Sure.
You do the research on 10 colleges, you pick 3, and then finally you end up making the last decision emotionally. That changed significantly, especially for the folks who didn't really have much to go with in the first place. So a lot of those folks ended up stuck.
Yeah, right.
They ended up taking gap years. They ended up not going to the optimal next choice. They ended up taking these alternative paths through boot camps. Some of them ended up rock climbing in Utah.
Right.
It's those folks who need to understand how has work evolved in the last couple of years, career discovery, but then also how do you actually find a job and find one that's self-fulfilling, self-actualizing, skill building. It's those skill sets that, ironically or not, these students have been more attuned to than previous generations.
That's interesting. Yeah, they're the mechanics of following this automatic path is less important than having that emotional maturity, perhaps, to make decisions. We hear a lot of, we obviously deal with the skilled trades, and we hear anecdotal stories of the narrative changing. The narrative now is the skilled trades are more respected as a financially rewarding career, and with everything from entrepreneurship, start ash heating in the air if you want, or go work for a big company like a big manufacturer. Have you seen that? I mean, is there something beyond anecdotes that's telling us? Have you seen any data that says this is happening in your world?
Removing the perspective that we used to have about vocational training in this country is probably the most important thing to do to save the U.S. job.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the fact that there's so much need for nurses, for mechanics, for blue-collar workers in the U.S., whilst there's so many people out of work, is probably the biggest crime that we've experienced in workforce in general, right? And it's because we've set this precedent that these jobs are lesser than not. And for some reason, this continues to be the case, although some people are realizing that it's not the case.
Yeah, it feels like, you mentioned earlier about COVID creating new dynamics, sometimes plenty unintentionally. Mm-hmm. It does seem like it cracked this open a little bit. Like, the sucking sound of that 4-year institution lost some of its appeal in COVID, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not going to go to that dorm. I didn't really want to do this, but the momentum carried me there. We broke so much momentum in 2020. Maybe that's been part of this.
Right. And I think people are interestingly taking a bit of a portfolio approach to their careers as well. I mean, you may love building and maintaining HVACs or not, but either way, you're going to also create a podcast on it and then talk about it on TikTok, and you're going to monetize it on YouTube, right? Like, most people are hustling around some central core set of skill sets, but they're monetizing it in very different ways. We're diversifying our own careers.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I haven't really thought about that, but I do see a lot more young folks in the trades doing something unique like podcasts or YouTube. That's really, really interesting. So, we talk about all the typical paths, but what we haven't talked about is how these things get funded, right? Like, what have you seen, any innovation around that? What does that look like now for a 16-year-old, 18-year-old, or a career learner? What kind of innovations have you seen around funding education?
Well, we also have the highest rates of debt in the US, unfortunately, right? And I think that the generation that took this cheaper money and didn't realize its consequences is starting to die out. So that's I think the good news. That's a big chunk of a problem we need to solve elsewhere. Pushing that aside for a second, most folks are realizing that when you're taking part in a role as a student, there are other third parties making sure that you are successful, or at least incentivized to do so, like an employer.
Right.
And that's birthed new business models like ISAs, income share agreements, where you don't pay for your school or your boot camp, but you end up paying it back through the compensation that your employer pays you.
Right.
So interesting models like ISAs, models like the ones that Guild have introduced, are really taking the market by storm, because it no longer puts the burden of proof on the individual learner to pay for their own education solution.
Yeah, that makes sense. Are you seeing also, it feels like kids 6, 9, 11th grade are thinking more about careers, or at least we're trying to give them an opportunity to think. Are you seeing that at all?
Yes, it's fantastic how very young children are talking about what they want to be when they grow up, right? I mean, and they're no longer unrealistic expectations. There's companies like Nepris, for example, that brings in very specific, specialized career professionals into the classroom through virtual experiences, and has them talk about, this is how I got the job, this is what my day looks like. This career discovery component is now available for any K-12 educator to just plug into a learning day at any age.
Sure, makes sense. Is it affecting the accessibility statistics, right? Because we certainly know there's a segment of this population who has much easier access, both financially, models, all kinds of things in a certain path, and then certain communities have been left out. Has EdTech helped bridge that gap at all?
I believe so. It's partially solved through EdTech, partially solved through the passions of the individual entrepreneur. One of the biggest problems in diversifying the tech workforce is that a lot of marginalized learners and students don't necessarily see themselves in a job on Wall Street or the new equivalent of whatever that most desired job was. Because people like them aren't necessarily portrayed as the traditional successful professional. But again, companies like Nepris are bringing in those folks, showing examples of a Latin American lady who's 25 years old making 10 times what her mom made a generation ago when they moved from Mexico.
Yeah. Have you seen anything you mentioned Mexico. Internationally, have you seen, we've heard stories of EdTech being pretty successful overseas where there isn't as much infrastructure in certain countries or certain places. What have you seen with international and the EdTech landscape?
It's very interesting. What we've seen over the last couple of years is literally millions of users suddenly come online, right? And when I mean online, I mean woke in the sense that they are now available digitally through their phones or whatever devices they have in their pocket or their bag, but also they are now aware of the technology. So it's this new generation that suddenly has this base layer of infrastructure that their parents didn't have, but also are being told by their nephews, their uncles, their aunts, everyone that, hey, there's this great tool for free that helps you understand what your skill sets are, what that next job is. And
right.
By the way, here's a tool to teach English to kids in China and make $25 an hour.
Right.
So 300 million consumers just popped up in Indonesia just overnight, right? There's similar activity happening in India. We're seeing the average number of cell phones per user increase because now people are buying a work phone and a personal phone and doing that themselves.
Yeah, so not only have obviously much greater awareness, but then there are the tools to then execute on some vision. Like, I do want to learn how to be a translator. Mm-hmm. And there you go, right there on your iPad or your Android device or your phone. Yeah, fantastic. Which is a nice segue into this last question. At Interplay, we show up every day because our mission is better careers, better lives. And everything we're talking about here is around education not for education's sake, but really better lives. It leads to a better life. Is that something you've seen as an EdTech accelerator, and you've seen the impact that some of these companies had on the customers that they're affecting? What have you seen in that capacity?
The historical perspective of education has been that you do it for two purposes, right? One is to be a better learner in general, right? Education for education's sake.
Yeah.
Or the other perspective has been education is about improving the life of yours and your families. And that's usually through a job.
Right, right.
I think those are actually becoming one and the same now, right? And it's through self-actualization. It's about understanding that you're going to be always learning. There's going to be room to improve the opportunities that you have access to, that your family has access to. So it's a wonderful thing that technology is enabling.
Yeah, fantastic. Ash, this has been really enjoyable. I really appreciate you taking the time today.
No, thank you, Doug.
Better careers, better lives.